Welcome to The Forgotten Soldier by Guy Sajer, a gripping and deeply personal story of a young soldier caught up in the chaos of the Eastern Front. These are his words. Let's begin. One September morning, we found ourselves in a farmyard somewhere in the south of Poland. The horror of our previous experiences had left us entirely without reaction, and we stared about us with the stunned eyes of someone who has been heavily drugged. A short way off, an officer was shouting something at us, a speech or a report, which fell on deaf ears. We stared at the sky to avoid thinking about the earth, which supported human life. Only an explosion, or perhaps a Feld's whistle, could have dragged us from our lethargy. However, in this district, there was at least a semblance of order, and under cover of this last fragment of organization, we were trying, as best we could, to recover our strength and some sense of morale. The Russian thrust to the south was so strong that we had to consider Romania enemy territory. We should soon be fighting in Hungary too, before Kecskemét and then in Budapest. The officer went on with his speech to talk of a counter-offensive, of regaining control of events, regrouping our troops, even of victory, a word which no longer had any meaning for us. Although we couldn't conceive of the defeat which lay ahead, we understood that victory was not possible. We knew that we would still be obliged to make intense efforts defending some particular organized positions, but we had no doubt that we could stop the enemy before the German frontier. Despite our general unease and near collapse and all our disillusion, we knew that we couldn't simply give up. The looming disaster was inconceivable to us. Even today, survivors of that experience find it difficult to accept all the facts. But despite our unshakable faith, we all felt temporarily unable to continue fighting. Some time off, some rest, was absolutely essential. We were in a state of exhausted collapse, capable of nothing. "General Friesner has re-established the Southern Front," the officer was shouting. "Our regiments will be reformed and reinforced by substantial reserves. The enemy must not go any further. You will stop him." We were divided into groups, companies, and regiments, and loaded into trucks. It seemed there was still gas hereabouts. The Gross Deutschland units were sent north, which surprised us, as the rest of the division, or what was left of it, was fighting with Army Group Center. Some units were already with Army Group North, and the two hard-pressed armies were eventually joined. The trucks took us to a train which was waiting on a single track, sheltered by a pine forest. There was no station. We left in a long string of miscellaneous cars. My group was loaded onto an open platform like the one which had taken me out of Poland and into Russia so long ago. Today there was no need to fear any future in Russia. The Germans had been chased from that country. Today we were going north, slowly and carefully, as the track might be mined, or the sky full of bombs. The train took us to Lodz, where we saw many astonishing things. We stayed in Lodz for about 30 hours. The front was very close, and like all towns near the fighting, Lodz was full of troops. As in the south, men were being sorted out and regrouped. 30, 40, even 50% of the names on the regimental lists had to be scratched off. In some cases, men already scratched off as dead or missing reappeared from the void. The Gross Deutschland had a rallying point at Lodz, a former candy shop stripped of all its wares, the adjoining room for the concierge, and a long corridor. A large panel correctly painted black on white, and a stylized white helmet. The regimental emblem hung over the door, which was still intact. 2 sentries in correct uniform were stationed on either side of the door. "Here we are," Lenson said, "back at the Gross Deutschland." For an hour and a half we had been tramping through the city, from which nearly all the civilians had gone, looking for this place. Lieutenant Vollers presented the officer at the center with his list of the men with him, including the numbers of their companies, regiments, and groups. There were about 200 of us. "Here is the list of men with me, Herr Hauptmann." "But you're bringing me a bunch of Ruskies, Herr Leutnant," the captain said, looking at our motley collection of clothes. Many of us were wearing padded Russian jackets. "My apologies, Herr Hauptmann. We began to run short of uniforms." "Very short," said the officer, smiling. "I'm going to send you to the store, and you'll see if there's anything left. You'll have to be quick because you won't be here long." In the next street, we found the divisional store, which was still much better stocked than the supply stores of ordinary divisions. Some of our men could be given quite a few of the things they needed. While we waited, we watched a crowd of men, part of a new Volkssturm battalion, swarm into a factory courtyard. When we looked more closely at these men, recently called up by the Führer, our eyes opened wide with surprise. They all belonged to the last class of reserves and seemed to be an even more extreme case than the Marie-Louise conscripts at the end of the Napoleonic era. Some of these troops with Mausers on their shoulders must have been at least 60 or 65, to judge by their curved spines, bowed legs, and abundant wrinkles. But the young boys were even more astonishing. For us who had saved our 18, 19, and 20-year-old lives through 1,000 perils, the idea of youth meant childhood and not adolescence, which was still our phase of life despite our disillusion. But now we were looking literally at children, marching beside these feeble old men. The oldest boys were about 16, but there were others who could not have been more than 13. They had been hastily dressed in worn uniforms cut for men, and were carrying guns which were often as big as they were. They looked both comic and horrifying, and their eyes were filled with unease, like the eyes of children at the reopening of school. Not one of them could have imagined the impossible ordeal which lay ahead. Some of them were laughing and roughhousing, forgetting the military discipline which was inassimilable at their age, and to which they had been exposed for barely 3 weeks. We noticed some heart-wringing details about these children who were beginning the first act of their tragedy. Several of them were carrying school satchels their mothers had packed with extra food and clothes instead of school books. A few of the boys were trading the saccharine candies which the ration allotted to children under 13. The old men marching beside these young sprouts stared at them with incomprehension. What would be done with these troops? Where were they expected to perform? There was no answer to these questions. Were the authorities going to try to stop the Red Army with them? The comparison seemed tragic and ludicrous. Would total war devour these children? Was Germany heroic or insane? Who would ever be able to judge this absolute sacrifice? We stood in profound silence, watching and listening to the final moments of this first adolescence. There was nothing else we could do. Some hours later, we were driven to a new assembly area a few miles from the Vistula in a town called Medau. There we found a large part of our full division, which had left us in the south long ago. Even our regiment was there, and its officers with their familiar names. The auxiliary services of our autonomous unit had performed enormous feats of imagination to continue functioning. We were extremely surprised to find that the full Gross Deutschland division was still quite strong, a discovery that raised our morale considerably. We needed to cling to some form of solidity to avoid recognition of the final tragedy which had engulfed us, and of our strictly limited choice between combat in the most desperate circumstances, captivity, or the end, once and for all. Here, on the banks of the Vistula, which could be considered the cradle of hostilities, we found companies restocked with young boys to fill the gaping holes the war had made in our elite division. We also found some familiar faces, including Wiener, the veteran, who seemed quite astonished that we were all still alive. "We must really be indestructible," he exclaimed. "When I left you on the 2nd Dnieper front, everything looked so black I really thought I'd never see any of you again." "Quite a few missing," Wohlers said, "and quite a few still here. Mein Gott, Leutnant." We told Wiener that Wesreidau was dead, and Frosch. He too had a list of names we could forget. No matter how intense the grief aroused by any particular name, the expressions on our worn faces never changed. We pressed Wiener for news of Germany, of civilian life there, and the situation of ordinary citizens. We all had reasons for concern and followed the movements of his lips, trying to grasp the implications of his inadequate words. "I was in the Kancia military hospital in Poland," he told us. "I had lost so much blood and seemed so weak that for 2 horrible days they did almost nothing about me. I would never have guessed that life had so strong a grip on me. It would have been so easy, one last sigh, and then into the hole. But it didn't happen that way. I groaned and howled for 10 days or so, especially the first 2, and went through infection, transfusion, disinfection, reinfection, and here I am, back with you again for another autumn of crap. Now I find the damp hard to take, too. I've got rheumatism, and that's fatal. As before, the veteran relieved his desperation by cracking jokes. But you must have had convalescent leave, didn't you? Yes, Hals. I was in Germany. I went to Frankfurt, not am Main, but am Oder. I could have gone further if I'd wanted to, but there wasn't any particular reason. They put us up in a girls' high school, sad to say, without the girls. There wasn't enough to eat, but at least they let us alone. Have you noticed, by the way, that I'm missing an ear? The veteran grinned sardonically. When we looked, we saw that his right ear was gone, and that his skin where the ear should have been was a pale, shiny pink, which looked as though it might break at any minute. We had all noticed without attaching any particular significance to it. So many men were missing one piece or another that we scarcely registered such things any more. Yes, Prince said. On that side, you look dead. The veteran grinned again. That's because you're so used to stiffs, you're beginning to see them even where there aren't any. Drop all the crap, Solma shouted, and tell us about Germany. Well, yes. There was a moment of silence which seemed to last forever. What's it like in Frankfurt? Asked Feldwebel Sperlovsky, elbowing the rest of us aside. He came from Frankfurt and his family was probably still there. The veteran was no longer looking at us. He seemed to be staring into his own interior. The high school was on the east banks of the Oder, up on a hill. You could see a big piece of the town from there. It was all gray, the color of dead trees with walls sticking up here and there, all black from the smoke of fires. People were living down there like Lancer in the trenches. As Sperlovsky listened, his face began to twitch and his voice trembled as he spoke. But our fighters, and flak, wasn't there any defense? Of course, but so out of proportion. Don't worry too much, Sperlovsky, Wohlers said. Your family was certainly evacuated to the country. No, Sperlovsky shouted in a voice of despair. My wife wrote me that she had been conscripted and had to stay in town. No one has the right to leave his job. Wiener knew very well what effect his words must have on an audience starved for good news, but nothing seemed to distress him anymore. It's total war, he said like an automaton. Nothing and no one will be spared, and German soldiers must be able to endure everything. Sperlovsky walked away. He looked stunned. His eyes were glazed and his steps faltered as if he were drunk. German soldiers would have to endure everything in the world we had created. We were fitted only for that world, and were otherwise inadaptable. Lenzen was as still as stone and listened, stony-faced. Is it the same for all our towns? Lindbergh asked. He must have been thinking of his town, by Lake Constance. I don't know, the veteran said. It's possible. You certainly know how to raise morale, said Hals in irritation. Do you want the truth or a fairy story? I felt as though I were wandering through a landscape shrouded with fog and strewn with rubble. I knew that I could never manage to be disappointed again. Before mourning with the suffering world, I would somehow have to regain my balance. Of course, I thought of Paula, but it was so long since I had heard anything from her that I wondered if I would even be capable of reading a letter if we should suddenly get mail. I was filling up with bad news like a barrel filling with water from a rain pipe. When the barrel is full to overflowing, all the torrents in the world are incapable of adding to its capacity. We found ourselves in one of the rare trains still moving through that region, rolling toward East Prussia through the first frosts of our third winter of war, the 5th or 6th for some of the older men. We moved at night with all our lights out as Russian planes, which occupied our bases in Poland, were particularly active by day. We were moving toward Prussia, Lithuania, Latvia, and the Courland front, to which the remnants of several German divisions were clinging. Through the darkness and the thick fog, we could see large masses of people moving on foot across the northern Polish landscape. At first we thought we were watching infantry units on the march, but after several good looks, we realized we were watching civilians, thousands of them, fleeing through the night and fog to escape the red hordes who they sensed were very close behind them. We couldn't linger to watch those people, but could easily imagine their situation. Then we crossed the Prussian frontier into the home territory of Lenzen and Smelens, two purebred Prussians suddenly back on their native soil. Lenzen stood up and leaned over the carriage door to get a closer look at his country. The rest of us didn't care so much. The landscape was scarcely distinguishable from that of Poland. Perhaps there were a few more lakes. Otherwise, as in Poland, there was forest. "You really ought to see it when there's snow on the ground," Lenzen said. He was suddenly smiling again. "This way, you can't really tell what it's like." As we remained silent and uninterested, he spoke up again. "You're in Germany, for the love of God. Wake up. Think how long you've been dreaming of this." "East Germany," Wiener said, "practically the front. And then, I don't know if you realize it, but I have a compass, and I can tell you we're moving to the northeast, which is no good at all." Once again, Lenzen turned purple with anger. "You're nothing but a bunch of milksops," he said. "It's your kind of defeatism that's brought us to this. The war is already lost inside your goddamned heads, but you've got to fight anyway, whether you want to or not." "Shut up!" shouted 5 or 6 voices. "If they want us to win the war, let them treat us like normal soldiers." "You're just a bunch of whining puppies. The whole time I've known you, you've done nothing but whine. For you, the war has been lost since Voronezh." "For good reason," Hall said. "You'll fight whatever the cost, and I'm the one who's telling you because you have no choice. There's no other way out." The veteran stood up. "Yes, Lenzen, we'll fight, because we can't stand the idea of defeat any better than you can, and we have no choice. I don't anyway. I'm part of a machine which operates a certain way, and only that way, and I've been part of it for too long." We stared at Wiener, somewhat taken aback. We had thought he would be able to adapt himself to any kind of life, and now here he was saying that he could live only for the cause which had already cost him so much. Lenzen went on grumbling, and we went on thinking confusedly about the glimpse of the future the veteran had given us. For me, from the vantage point of Prussia, France seemed remote and unimportant. The cause which Wiener spoke of was also my cause, and despite all the difficulties and disappointments I had endured, I still felt closely linked to it. I knew that the struggle was becoming more and more serious, and that we would soon be obliged to face appalling possibilities. I felt a strong sense of solidarity with my comrades, and I could think of my own death without too much flinching, as a soothing veil that would fall slowly over me and all my terrors of the past, present, and future. My head seemed to be filled with a milky fog, which was without joy, but which suddenly made everything easy. Did my comrades feel the same way? I couldn't be sure, but my resignation seemed general. We rolled on for several hours at a reduced speed. Finally, we stopped and walked through the gray, foggy morning to a camp of wooden huts whose appearance recalled the robust military organization only recently lost. We were given an hour to rest and the chance of a cup of hot water with a few grains of soya in it. "And to think that some fellows volunteered for the food," somebody muttered. "There couldn't be too many volunteering these days," another voice said. "Very few are around for long enough even to dream of becoming an officer. There's hardly the time to make Obergefreiter before they're getting a posthumous stripe." A few were still around for a little longer than that. Then a major, who was probably the camp commander, spoke to us. "Proud soldiers of the Gross Deutschland," he said, "your arrival in this sector fills us with joy. We know your reputation for courage in combat, which gives us a strong sense of support. Your comrades in arms in the infantry regiments fighting in the Polish forests near our frontiers feel as we do. Your arrival here reassures and comforts us, and also helps us in the extremely difficult task which has fallen on us, the defense of German and European liberty against the Bolsheviks, who would take it from us, employing the most extreme and bestial means. Today, more than ever before, our unity in combat must be total and deliberate. With the addition of your strength, we shall build a definitive rampart against the Soviet horde. Think of yourselves as the trailblazers of the European Revolution, and feel proud that you have been chosen for this undertaking, however heavy it may be. I wish the greatest possible glory for you, and convey to you the congratulations of the Führer and of the High Command. Transportation and food have been specially placed at your disposal to help you in achieving your aims. Bravo, soldiers, and courage. I know that so long as a single German soldier remains alive, no Bolshevik will ever tread on German soil. Heil Hitler. We gaped at the elegant officer in stunned silence, trying to penetrate the veil of ignorance which hid our valor from us. Heil Hitler, shouted a Feld, who realized that the prescribed response to the major's remarks had not occurred. Heil Hitler, we shouted heroically. Either I'm crazy, Kellerman muttered, or he was expecting us to raise his morale. Shh, said Prince, we're getting another speech. This time it was a Hauptmann. It will be my privilege, he said, to take 2/3 of the men in your regiment under my command and lead them into battle. We all had known what was waiting for us, but that phrase made us swallow hard. The entire division will be operating in a sector to the north of us. It will be broken up into several fragments so that a series of widely scattered attacks can be made against the Russian thrust, which is extremely strong in this sector. I'm expecting from you the utmost in courage and actions of distinction and glory. These are essential because we must stop the Russians here. No negligence or hesitation will be allowed. 3 officers can constitute a court-martial at any time and sanction any penalty. Poor Frosch, how many officers decided to hang you? We shall be victorious here or be covered with shame. No Bolshevik must ever, I repeat, ever set foot on German soil. And now, my friends, I have some good news for you. There is mail for some of you and citations and promotions, but before giving free rein to your joy, you must present yourselves at the store for fresh rations and ammunition. Dismiss. Heil Hitler. We broke ranks without any clear idea of our situation. Things are looking up, I said. A bastard who'd be glad to see us all killed, muttered Hals. We were standing in a long line in front of a large wooden building. So that's what we get instead of West Riedau. Something tells me we'll be having a few eye-openers, Prince. Impossible. We've already seen everything there is to see. He's another one of these madmen, said Hals. He's not. He's perfectly right, said another voice behind us. We turned around in surprise. He's right. It has to be here or not at all. I can't explain why without taking too long, but he's right. More and more disconcerted, we stared at Wiener without saying a word, unable to grasp his attitude, which suddenly seemed so changed. I'll tell you why some other time, Wiener said. For now, you're too thick to get it. Paula, as I write, I'm looking at the letter I've longed for so much, and as I read your lines, I forget the icy ground and the east, which is still so filled with menace. Your letter, which is in my hand, seems like a miracle from heaven. I don't expect anything more from the ordinary world, from which we seem entirely cut off. I read your lines as our comrade Smellens, who is lucky enough to believe in God, recites his prayers. Nothing can help us any more, Paula. Prayers seem like vodka. They blunt the cold for a moment. Happiness has become entirely relative and can mean simply daybreak, because darkness makes us think of death. I have been promoted to Obergefreiter, and although the stripes are still in my left pocket, I already feel that much more important. I think these extraordinary and difficult moments have made us into men. I can hear a roar in the east, Paula, but maybe it's only the wind. I look forward so much to reading another letter. For several days now, we had been fighting again as we retreated. The Bolsheviks must never set foot on German soil. However, 3 powerful Soviet armies had already crossed the German frontier at 5 or 6 points, penetrating to a depth of some 30 miles. These 3 armies had rolled over our defending troops, whose survivors were dragging with them through the autumn countryside the last weapons which supported their claim to be part of an army. To my regret, I am unable to retrace in detail the chaos of those bitter moments. But I can outline the ends of my friends like Prince, Sperlovsky, and Solma, and of Lenzen, who, in spite of everything, was really a friend. And it is Lenzen I wish to salute now by describing the tragedy of his death, which I can still see clearly through the memories of so many other deaths. Whatever Lenson may have thought of me at times, I'm certain that for all of us, and for his country, he was a brave man who would have sacrificed his life without hesitation to help the most insignificant fellow soldier. The manner of his death fully supports this view of him, and it is perhaps because of him that I am sitting here now, writing these lines. Lenson could never have accepted life as it is lived today, with all the concessions the former troops of the Eastern Front are obliged to make. Like the order for which he died, he was irreversible. Men who have embraced one idea can live only by and for that idea. Beyond it, they have nothing but their memories. Our attempt to save the Courland front failed, and the overpowering Russian thrust reached the Baltic at several points, which I can no longer locate with any precision. The northern front was cut in two, the far north around the Bay of Riga as far as Libau, and the sector to which we were sent, a continuously shrinking front to the west of Libau in Prussia and Lithuania, clinging farther south to the Vistula, which was the scene of hideous carnage. That concludes the 35th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.